My Stars Over Colorado quilt uses two basic methods, snowballed corners and half-squared triangles. So I'm going to walk you through both of those today. First, I'll be demonstrating the snowballed corners. And they're going to require two pieces of fabric. As a smaller square, that will be the corner, and a larger piece, and this larger piece can sometimes be a square and sometimes be a rectangle. I need to draw a line, first of all, corner to corner on the small square. Now there's a couple ways, little tricks you can do that. I like to have a smaller, narrower ruler because I can see the edge better. It's pretty important that you get the line going directly into the corner on both. Now, something darker in the background often helps. Another trick that helps often is to use very fine sandpaper. And putting the two layers on can be helpful. The sandpaper keeps everything from shifting as you're drawing, because sometimes if you draw too heavily, it will make the fabric move out from under the ruler. I've also got a line drawn on here that I can use if my fabric is hard to see on top of the sandpaper, which these are two similar tones, and so I could do it that way. And then I can line up my corners on the line and line up the ruler on the line. And when I draw the line, I will get a line that goes directly into the corners. I've drawn it very lightly, and you can see now that it's gone right into the corners. Now in your instructions, there will be a picture, and it will show you which corner you're going to snowball. Sometimes there's more than one corner, sometimes there's only one. But for example, on this one, it tells us that we want to snowball it in the top right corner, and we want the diagonal line to be going that direction, so that when we sew it and fold it open, it will look like the picture. Now in this case, we're going to sew directly on that line, and then I'm going to come back and show you how to finish it. Once the seam is sewn, then we are going to press this open like this, and the two sides of this square are going to cover each other. I'll be right back. And there it is pressed, but before I call it done, I want to get rid of the unnecessary layers back here. So I will open it up again. Oh, easier said than done. And trim off these extra pieces, which are just causing extra bulk. So I set the 1/4 inch line of the ruler on the seam line and cut those off. And there is our finished snowballed corner. You may be wondering why it's called that, but it came from a snowballed block, where if you snowball all four corners of a larger square, you would end up with something that resembles a circle or a snowball. And now to show you the half square triangles. Half square triangles are a really common element of many quilts, and so you might have a method already that you love, and that's fine, as long as you're doing a method that starts with two squares and makes two half square triangles, because that's how the directions are written. So to begin with, we need to sew, put our fabrics together, and sew a 1/4 inch away from a center line right here. Now you can accomplish that in several different ways. If you have a 1/4 inch foot on your machine, the easiest thing to do, I believe, is to draw that line down the middle, just like we did for the snowballed corner. And then you can use your foot and put it right on that line and guide it a 1/4 inch on both sides. Or if you use something on your sole plate to guide your 1/4 inch seam, you wouldn't be able to see that when you're sewing these. So another option is to use 2 lines, and we're going to draw one on either side, 1/4 inch, by putting the 1/4 inch line of the ruler on those 2 corner points. And then draw a line here and repeat it by turning it around and doing the same thing for the other side. Now in this case, when you layer your 2, you're going to sew directly on those lines, or just maybe a skosh on the inside so that it still leaves enough room for trimming. And I have one more example to show you of how to sew those 2 lines, but it involves a certain setup on the machine, so I'm going to move the camera over there. Here I am at my machine, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to set things up. First of all, I have my machine set for the needle to be in the position where this is the edge of the 1/4 inch seam. And I'm going to put my needle down, my foot down for right now, because I need to put my piece of masking tape, and I've got one all ready to go here, and I would like to put it so that it's even with the edge of my foot right here, and the 1/4 inch line lines right up with my needle. So here's my masking tape. This is going to be my guide as I'm sewing. I have to keep the ruler from shifting and get this down. Okay, so what I've got here is a line that I can follow. Now, here's a set of fabrics. Right sides together if that's necessary. I'm using some batiks that it doesn't matter. And I'm going to start with my foot, the edge of my 1/4 inch seam, right again on the point of those fabrics. And I'm lining up the other point of the fabric on that piece of masking tape that I just put down. And I'm going to sew. And while I sew, I'm going to keep my eye right here and keep that edge, that corner, always on the edge of the masking tape. And by doing that, you can see that I ended up with my the edge of the foot was right on the edge of the other corner. And then I'll turn around and do the very same thing. Go in the other direction. And this way I have sewn 1/4 inch away from that imaginary diagonal line now. Now, this method is dependent on 2 things. First of all, you do need to have a 1/4 inch edge or a 1/4 inch foot that you can follow. And you are limited on the size of half square triangles that you can sew based on how much distance you have between your needle and the edge of your table, how far you can put your masking tape. For me, I have 10 inches. So the largest one I can do is a 7-inch half square triangle, but that still gives me a lot of options. So now that you've sewn your 2 lines, it's time to trim. And just like I gave you multiple ways to sew them, I'm going to show you multiple ways to trim them. And you might want to pay attention to different ways because there are many different sizes of half square triangles in this set of directions in this quilt. And you might have to use a different method if your quilt squares are a size that you can't handle in one method. So you might want to know more than one. So first of all, you might ask the question, why do we need to trim in the first place? Well, there's a mathematical reason for that. And that is because this distance right here has turned into, because of the math behind it, a factor of the square root of 2. Now, if you remember from math class, the square root of 2 is an irrational number and you won't find it on your ruler. So therefore, when we cut along here and open that up, I'm going to have a square that is some odd thing that won't measure exactly what it needs to be. So if that's the case, I either have to cut my original squares as a square root of 2, which again is not on the ruler, or I have to trim them to get it down to a number that I can use. So that's why we trim. So first of all, I'm going to show you a method that uses just a plain ruler, and it's going to trim them before I cut them apart. And then I'm going to show you some where you can trim them or cut them apart first and then trim. So this requires a ruler, and I like this square one, but it requires a ruler that is at least as big as the square this way and this way. And this particular square started off at 4 inches, and my directions would tell me I have to trim it to 3.5. So I'm looking, first of all, just on my ruler and finding the 3.5 lines. And my particular ruler has these dots on it, and there is a diagonal line of dots that goes all the way across, and I'm going to keep that in mind and start by putting these 3.5-inch marks on my seam, and then I'm going to fine-tune it by getting the dots lined up, and my seam line should be quite straight, but it's not going to be perfect, and so I do my best to get the dots lined up the best as I can. And I'm going to look at the edges over here and make sure that I have a little bit to trim on both of those edges. And when I have it lined up like I like, I can go ahead and cut those two sides off. Okay, my angle was a little goofy there, so I had to do it twice. So then I would turn it around and do the same thing. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to cut them in half now and show you what I get. This now will be a nice 3.5-inch triangle after it's been, or half square triangle after it's been pressed. Before, however, I'm going to trim off my dog ears right here. Making a snip, you can use your ruler and make a right angle right here. You can eyeball it like I do. Flip it over and do the same thing on this side. I'm just cutting a right angle with this original edge. Okay, so it may be that you prefer a different method. And then I would cut them in half first, like this one is. This one was cut in half but not trimmed. And then I would open it up and press it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about pressing. I'm recommending that these get pressed open. Why? Because there are going to be a lot of these diagonal seams, in any place where they join together, it's going to make some bulk, and I'm trying to reduce that. So let me go take that to the iron and I'll be right back. So there I've pressed it, and now I'm going to get ready to trim it. You can trim it from either side. It doesn't really matter. We just need to be able to view that line. So going back to my ruler, I had this 3.5-inch square in my mind, those 3.5-inch marks, and now I'm looking at it all the way around as the 3.5-inch square. And I want to center it so that this diagonal 45-degree line on my ruler is on the seam line, and there's a little bit to trim all the way around. And then I can trim it. And the nice thing about this method is it takes off those dog ears while you're trimming. I'll turn it over this way. If you have a rotary mat, it's really helpful. And I'm going to line it up again. This time I'm lining the 3.5 inch lines right on those edges because I've already trimmed them. And I'm just taking off a skosh to make it not irrational. And there I have a lovely 3.5 inch square. Okay, and then my other one over here that I sewed, I will do the same with pressing, and you will see that it is also a lovely 3.5 inch square. So there's pros and cons to each of these methods. This one, I only had to trim 2 sides because I was doing them 2 at a time. And it always ends up, this method, with the seam line exactly in the corners, which is what we want. But I did have to then trim up the dog ears, so that was about the same amount of trimming. Now, you were noticing that this method is dependent on having a ruler that has a 45-degree line that goes into a corner. And there is the possibility that you don't have that. So I will show you what you can do in that case. In case, I like them divided and pressed. So I'm going to start with that. There it is, divided and pressed. And this time I'm going to use a 45-degree line on my mat. Now, I believe every mat comes with a 30, 45, and 60-degree line. Make sure you find the 45. From that 45-inch line, identify a 3.5 inch square or whatever size you're doing. So I'm going to start with this corner right here, go over 3.5 inches, down 3.5, and there I have a 3.5 inch square. Keep that square in your mind. You can, if you want to, mark it with masking tape. But I'm going to put my half square triangle on it. I want my seam line lined up on the 45-degree line. I want the edges to be right at or just past that 3.5 inch square that I found. So now that I have it on there without moving it, make sure you don't have any shifting. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to cut it on every side. And here I'm just lining up my ruler on a horizontal line. Make sure it doesn't shift. Oh, see, I just shifted it, and that's the hard part about this method. But I do know that in this particular quilt that I needed to use this method for some of the larger triangles. So do get this down. Oh boy, I'm really having trouble here. And then, without boring you any further, I'm going to continue and trim off the other 2 sides too. And again, this will give you, when I trim here and here, the square will have this diagonal line going right directly into the corners, which is very important. Okay, so there you have a lot of different options for squaring up, for trimming up your half square triangles. Now that I've shown you all of these options, it's time to test out which options you like best. So get out some scrap fabric and give them a go. You also might have a tool specific to trimming half square triangles, and if that's the case, feel free to use it.